this open discussion, each speaker is allowed to ask 2 questions, one to each opposing speaker, where each debater can one to each opposing speaker. The third part is a 24-minute Q&A session with the participants. Participants are required to keep their questions short, and note that no follow-ups are allowed, and members of the media are asked to keep their questions for the press conference after. We will close the debate with a 4-minute remark from each speaker. By the throw of a die, it is determined that the sequence of speakers will be first, Shahril Hamdan, second, YB Kelvin, and third, YB1 Ahmad Fayhsal. Over to you, Chair.
Now to begin with our segment 1, which is the opening remarks for each of our debaters, I would like to invite Saudara Shahril Hamdan for his 4-minute opening remark.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Salam keluarga Malaysia. Terima kasih saudara pengacara majlis, Yang Berhormat Timbalan Menteri Ahmad Fayhsal, Yang Berhormat Kelvin, pimpinan-pimpinan pelajar, tuan-tuan puan-puan, saudara-saudari saya hormati dan dimuliakan sekalian. Terima kasih atas jemputan kepada kami bertiga untuk berdebat di pentas ini. Dan debat ini saya dipahamkan akan diadakan majoritinya dalam bahasa Inggeris, jadi saya mohon izin untuk berbicara banyaknya dalam bahasa Inggeris. It's been 5 years since I debated in MSLS and a full 15 years since I directed the first MSLS in this very hotel. As the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But one thing key has changed, because in the past, especially before May 2018, most debates and forums operated in a rigid, limited paradigm. One side had power, and one side never had power. BN guys like me can take credit for everything good that's ever happened in this country, and the other side can attack, promise the sun and the moon like hari ni menang, esok harga minyak turun. Or hari ni menang, esok PT-PTN batal, and never have to walk the talk. But things are a bit different now. Since May 2018, each one of us on this stage has tasted the pahit and the manis of being in government, tasted the sweet and the poison of governing in a place like Malaysia. And I want to suggest that that gives us an opportunity to debate and to talk and to discuss in a different manner this time, to raise the bar this time. Because we want to move away from simply government versus opposition, attack versus defend, good versus evil, and instead be clear-eyed about where we stand, what's happening around us, and what's the best course of action for Malaysia in this increasingly tenuous world. I repeat, this increasingly tenuous world. Because yes, we are here today to speak of Malaysia's future, that's the topic of the debate, but we have to speak of Malaysia's future in its true regional and global context. We cannot continue with this Malaysian psychodrama, fighting with ourselves, fighting about 3 pages of Jawi, or who owns an expensive watch, when the world watches on in bemusement at how small and how self-absorbed our conversations can be sometimes. We've got to do better because a few things have occurred or escalated this past 3 years that has changed everything. First, a global pandemic that has disrupted decades-old conventions, production patterns, trade patterns, economic activity has changed in a way that fundamentally shifts the worldview around efficiency to resilience. What is Malaysia's response to that? Second, Russia and Ukraine is just the latest warning that the global order that we got used to since the end of the Cold War, where we assume that as economies become more intertwined, peace just comes out of it, that assumption is no longer safe. And Malaysia's got to think how it moves from that. And third, closer to home, we've got an increasingly aggressive China with its military encroachments and the US responding with its own geopolitical moves that includes a trade framework. And there's questions about ASEAN as an organization and how prepared it is to respond to these things, because there's a feeling, there's a sense that while Southeast Asia becomes a region of global contest, there's a sense that sometimes we're mere spectators in our own backyard because we're too divided or too distracted to act. So yes, in brief, we've got to talk about Malaysia, but we've got to talk about Malaysia in a way that makes our conversations bigger. That doesn't mean that we don't solve or we don't deal with real issues on the ground, whether it's VVO now, whether it's flooding of Muda, whether it's cost of living, whether it's availability of subsidized cooking oil. But we have to speak and discuss in a way that realizes that the world doesn't wait. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saudara Shahril Hamdan. Now, over to you, YB Kelvin Yee, for your 4-minute remark.
Okay, thank you so much, our moderator for this afternoon. Selamat petang, salam sejahtera, salam harapan. Saya ucapkan kepada semua. It is good to be here, and also thank you so much for the organizers and friends from the media. My name is Kelvin. I'm the Member of Parliament for Bandar Kuching, as well as DEPSI and Pakatan Harapan Youth Chief. So today in our debate, I'm very honored to be standing next to Saudara Shahril and of course Saudara Waf on a discussion and our vision towards a future and a forward Malaysia. But before this, allow me to frame the angle that I plan to approach this debate or even this discussion. You see, it is painful and to a certain extent an agony to see Sri Lanka, a country which some 70 years ago was known as the jewel of South Asia. It has embarked on a journey of ruin and destruction, ending as a bankrupt nation and a failed state. So I'm not in any way insinuating or propagating that Malaysia will be like Sri Lanka. But imagine this. If Sri Lanka in that 70 years had been introspective, had been asking questions, what will go wrong, self-correcting themselves, resetting its fundamentals, resetting its nation-building policies and principles, it could have avoided the fate it is in today. So, if Sri Lanka would have addressed its issues and flaws on corruption, abuse of power, flaming of ethno-religious sentiments to cover up failures of economic and, of course, social welfare policies. However, my friends, in every chaos, there is opportunities. In every failures, there is lessons to be learned. In the context of Malaysia, we need to go, and I strongly believe in this, we need to go on a national introspection to ask ourselves, what has went wrong? Why have we not been able to fulfill our potential as a world-class great nation, especially with the fundamentals that we have? But instead, in many countries, or even a global stage, many know us as, to a certain extent, kleptocracy at its worst. So let us be honest. One of the biggest cancer that is facing our country is the issue of corruption. The CPI, or the Corruption Perception Index, in Malaysia is a grave concern. When Pakatan Harapan took over government, we saw an improvement, a jump to 51st place, which was the best in 25 years. Then, since then, it has dropped and it has collapsed, and right now we are the lowest in 27 years. You see, these are issues that needs to be addressed. Concerns and anxieties on even the separation of powers and the rule of law in our countries. Issues such as fanning of religious and ethno sentiments to cover up failures of policy and governance. You see, we are a plural nation. Malaysia's strength is in its diversity. That is why we are here to discuss, for me, the four main C's that we are facing in this world today, which is COVID, conflicts on the international level, cost of living, and of course, climate change. I'm not a debater. I'm a trained medical doctor. And as a doctor, I want to approach today's debate as this. I want to identify the disease that we are facing, then prescribe medications and treatment towards that disease. I'm not here to win an argument, but let us discuss a future for our country. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, YB Kelvin Yee. YB Wan Ahmad Fayhsal, your 4-minute remark, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri. Wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to my fellow respected panelists, and of course to all guests, especially students. And I'm, as much as Shahril and others, I'm also recollecting my memories in this hall. I've been attending MSLS since I was, 22, 23, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and had a wonderful time then, and hopefully we're going to have wonderful exchanges as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm standing here in front of you today, not wearing so much my partisan line. I'm here to invite all of you to ponder upon the future of not just this country, but the whole spectrum of our region and civilization. Back in 2018, when I was finishing my master's in King's, I attended an important exhibition in National Gallery, where a famous 18th century painter, American painter by the name of Thomas Cole, painted and produced marvelous work of art depicting the rise and fall of civilization. As we all know, when we try to understand a particular fate of a country, or a people, or a nation, one has to look upon history in order to understand the dynamics of the issues and challenges. I would like to rest and build a framework for my debate today based on the work done by the late English historian Arnold J. Toynbee, who has commissioned a wonderful work called A Study of History. Arnold J. Toynbee had a very interesting observation why a particular civilization or country or nation rise and fall. Of course, there are others as well who observe such studies like Spengler, and from Muslim point of view, we had Ibn Khaldun, Malik bin Nabi. But Toynbee had a very interesting thesis. He said that a civilization seldom dies because of murder. Most often than not, a civilization dies because of a suicide. Why he says that? Because Toynbee studied about 22 civilizations, Ottoman, just Roman Empire and others. And from his observation, he says that when a particular civilization fails to respond to challenges, whether internal contradiction, structural weaknesses that lead to moral decay, then such barbarian at the gate, like what the Vandals had ransacked Rome and others, happen as some of the signals where a particular country or nation will succumb to such fate. Malaysia does not exclude from such dynamics in history of our people. After 60 years of independence, we are too succumb to such challenges. And as the topic or the theme of the conference today shows, the solution lies, as what Toynbee said, if the creative minority. Who are these people? You guys. These are scholars, experts, who will, throughout the history of man, will always provide creative solution to such challenges. And hopefully today I would able to garner some of the suggestions from you guys and had a wonderful exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, YB Wan Ahmad Fayhsal. Just before we move on to our next segment, I'd like to kindly remind our participants to please put on your mask at all times during the session. Now, moving on to the second part of this debate, the second segment. Now, the first part of the second segment will be focused on inflation and subsidies. A little background of it. I don't really think that's much to actually introduce about this, as that's all we hear about these days. But with inflation at 3.4% and food inflation at 6.1%, despite government subsidies, the rakyat, especially B40 households, are feeling the impact. Now, there are two concerns within this debate. Firstly, there's the question of whether this blanket subsidy is efficient and effective. Secondly, given an already problematic fiscal position, how can we continue to help the poor in this long-term battle? With that, I'd like to begin with a broad question for all three debaters. What is your plan to help alleviate the pressure, and how can we keep funding such policies? Is it targeted subsidies, or even a more robust taxation system? What about GST, CGT, or even inheritance tax? Now, onto the 4-minute speeches. I'd like to kindly invite Saudara Shahril Hamdan for his 4-minute speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Respectfully, I'm going to be a bit more creative in my response to this particular motion. I just want to say two things as a matter of fact when it comes to inflation and subsidies. Our subsidy bill is the highest ever under this administration at 78 billion ringgit. And consequently, that's why in part, because of that, our inflation rate is among the lowest in this region. Now, that doesn't mean there's no pain, and that doesn't mean I don't have to justify or explain this. I will during the Q&A if there are any, but I want to move on to what I think is more important, which is the crux of the matter. And the crux of the matter is, like all our intro remarks indicate, is that we've got to identify what the systemic economic problems are in this country, because that's what's causing pain. It's not this short-term pressure. Short-term pressure will always happen. It's the systemic issues that we've got to talk about. And the systemic issues to me are four. One, we've got, well, not four, a couple. One, we've got stagnant wages. We've got too many low-quality jobs for too many Malaysians. We've got persistent inequality, and we haven't updated our value proposition to outside investors in a situation where we've got competition from neighbors. So that's really the systemic issue that I think is important. Is it exhaustive? No. But I would wager that if we were to discuss very specific things like CGT, GST, we'll all come back to these four systemic issues. So let's talk about them. If those are the systemic issues, what's our pitch? What's our plan to solve them? Here's my pitch. My sense is, first, we've got to have a plan for 5 to 10 years. The next 5 to 10 years, we've got to reimagine and reinvigorate our export-led growth model. Our export-led growth model that basically ensures we have higher economic complexity that can attract talent and investors. We cannot be stuck being a low-cost factory for the rest of the world. We cannot be stuck being an exporter of commodities. We've got to think more economically complex stuff that has local supply chain involved as well. So think more stuff like downstream palm oil. Think stuff like wafer fabrication. Think stuff like green financing. Think stuff like graphene, in terms of one example of downstream palm oil activities. This will help arrest the brain drain from UK grads like you guys and stop the situation where local grads think it is better to be TikTok influencers or e-hailing riders. So that's one of the things we've got to do. Secondly, we need to radically enhance our social protection policies that nobody is left behind. Especially more so if, like I said, in the next 5 to 10 years, we've got to do really radical stuff around the economic complexity issue. There will be winners and losers. There will be some industries that will have to die. Some subsidies will have to be cut. Behaviors will have to be induced to change. There will be winners and losers. The losers, we've got to ensure they live above a minimum dignified threshold. So, for example, one of the things that I think the country has to discuss is whether we want to introduce an automated social benefit system that does not depend on year-to-year budget announcement from MOF or whoever is PM. Right now, it's basically ad hoc. Whenever somebody feels that it's important to give out cash aid and it is popular to do so, we do so. But maybe it's time for Malaysia to move and graduate to a point where it becomes automated, it becomes transparent, it becomes something that people can expect rather than something that is dished out as a political football. Lastly, in ensuring that these things happen, especially the economic complexity, especially stuff around social protection, government will have to spend. And I want to go out on a limb here, and I know Minister of Finance may not be so happy, but in my mind, for the next 5 to 10 years, we've got to spend, and we've got to spend big. We need to have a fiscal infrastructure that allows for big government injection that increases productive capacity, that increases the stuff that I mentioned about. If that means we need to amend certain laws, let's do it. This is a personal opinion. This is not a PMO opinion. Personal opinion, this is what I think the country needs if we want to change the game, because that's something that Malaysia will have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saudara Shahril Hamdan. Now to spice it a bit up, I would like to invite YB1 Ahmad Fayhsal to, I guess, ask the first question to Saudara Shahril Hamdan.
What is your notion, Brother Shahril, of good governance? You mentioned that the government need to spend big. We have been spending big since Najib Razak's time, with all those mega projects here and there. But as recently being reported by our PAC, there are regrettable incidences, cases that couldn't be justified whatsoever when it comes to return of investment for such projects like the stealthy littoral combat ship, the most advanced combat ship we have ever produced. And we even lied to our royalty when he launched the ship in Lumut back then. I'm not attacking you on that basis, but I just want to know what is your notion of good governance of such projects. Thank you.
What's my notion of good governance? My notion of good governance is that I don't get caught on a video saying that I'll give surat sokongan to people. I mean, I will take a lecture from a few people, but I won't take a lecture from you, YB. Because in managing an economy, obviously you've got to have a plan on how you ensure minimum leakages. But you've got to also have a plan on what you'll do. And the problem with your side, and especially even now that you join us in attacking Pakatan Harapan occasionally, but you were from Pakatan Harapan. You came into power to Pakatan Harapan. You became somebody that people knew because of Pakatan Harapan. And the issue here is, folks like you will always figure out when it comes to BN, I can't attack what actually their plans or their credibility of their plans are. I just attack on stuff around leakages. I attack specific stuff around corruption, and I hope people think that that's enough. I don't think that's enough. I think when you want to run an economy and you want to have people vote for you, you've got to have a sense of what you will spend on. And I think Barisan Nasional has an idea, has a strong track record, and we go into election with a clear plan that we want to develop this country, with a clear plan that we want to transit this country into something that is better than before, and we will not simply just say that we will improve unemployment, but after that my solution is Gojek. We will not just say that I want to improve inequality, but after that I cut cash aid. I won't say I want to improve gaji bermaruah, after that I only give 50 ringgit extra minimum wage. That's, I think, the problem in Pakatan Harapan, and that's why I think Barisan Nasional, when the election comes, we will still win it because people believe in us.
Thank you, Saudara Shahril. I would like to ask YB Kelvin Yee to give his 4-minute remark.
Okay, thank you so much. Things seem to be getting spicy. But as a doctor, I'm trying to avoid the politics, but I want to paint a picture, especially what I believe the fundamental economic policies we should have and moving forward. Just to respond a little bit to what Shahril says about Pakatan not doing enough. Fact of the matter is, yes, on the perspective of that, we have not done enough, but we cannot judge a 5-year report card in 2 years. I think fundamentals need time to build, fruits need time to bear, and that is where here I am to propose some things that we have been since the beginning, fundamentals and principles that as a coalition we believe in. I agree with Shahril that this is a time that we need to spend. We are facing a recession. The signs and indicators are there, and this is not a time for the government to be stingy, but a government to help the people put food on the table. I would like actually to propose what we believe a forefront to build a productive nation, a nation where the state enables its citizens to fulfill its full potential. And this is based on 3 main economic thrusts. Number 1, a care economy and social safety net. Fully agree with what Shahril says. But why do I see this as number 1? Second, revamping of a talent pipeline to address the skills mismatch that we have in our country. And number 3, something that's even more evident now especially, which is the need to enhance our food security. When it comes to care economy and enhancing social protection, this is something close to my heart because I'm directly involved in healthcare. Why do we need to help ramp up healthcare infrastructure and manpower when it comes to economy? because there is a direct correlation from good healthcare and care to productivity in economy. There is direct correlation. If we provide good care to our elderly and most vulnerable in society, we can empower both parents and adults to be involved in the economic process. That is why we need to prepare a care workforce, maybe even introduce an appropriate regulatory framework to ensure home givers, caregivers are properly regulated and empowered to ensure that they can take care of the elderly, take care of the children, so the adults can contribute, especially the women can contribute to the economy. This helps give a good precursor to organize our social protection ecosystem into a life cycle approach from cradle to grave. And this is something very important. Number two, revamping talent pipeline to address skills mismatch. And we have seen this. The COVID pandemic has seen people lost jobs. Now there is a huge mismatch, not just of unemployment, but underemployment. Right now we read in the statistics, 72% of SPM leavers do not want to continue their studies. Why? We need to understand their anxieties. Why do they not want to further their education? So the problem is, what is the point of furthering to a tertiary education if the pay is going to be low after graduation? Might as well I start a business. Might as well I be a migrant in Singapore, Australia, or even in the UK. So that is where we need to revamp, regulate the gig economy, cloud economy, issues such as influencers, talent creators. We need to regulate, make sure they're protected, social security, SOCSO, and so on and so forth. Give them ability to unionize, to have collective demanding power. We need to protect them, and we need to protect our young people for jobs of the future. We need to revamp our TVET system. This is something so important. Number three, we have to reorganize our education pipeline, and I'm going to summarize with this. Food security. As I said, we cannot see this separate to the economy. We need to revamp, we need a clear national food security policy actions. And with that, maybe I'll take questions after that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, YB. All right, thank you, YB. Now I would like to invite YB Ahmad Fayhsal to deliver his 4-minute remark.
Just now, Brother Shahril has made a colorful jab at me. But that's the nature of debate. And I am happy to be able to share the stage with him on this part. But again, whenever I debate or talk or discuss with my fellow compatriot from UMNO and Bersatu National, there's always the elephant in the room that they dare not to ask or even investigate. The issue that I brought first just now in my opening, that Malaysia is facing what we call a moral decay. We have best talents across the country. We have natural resources, good institutions, but unfortunately, poor governance. I can agree with Brother Shahril's responses and suggestions on various aspects of growth and development. No doubt, there's not much to be debated about on that aspect, except the details. But when it comes to addressing what Dr. Kelvin just now has said, the issue of kleptocracy is still lingering with us. And I think we agree on the same page. Reform must be made in order for us to save our economy. Remember, our fellow audience, the world is not going to be in a very calm water. Geopolitics play a very important role in determining the stability of our regional economy and the world economy at large. And the government is basically being spread too thin with the subsidy, very high subsidy, and also not to mention, today I managed to read a special report by The Age, a very good report, on the worrying trend of our federal government's debt. There's a tendency for our debt to reach 100% ratio by GDP in 15 years' time. That would definitely cause a lot of opportunity loss to other development expenditures. So in this matter, I believe we need to do a really serious reform in politics. I'm not saying that UMNO or Bersatu National has all the illnesses in this country, no. What I mean is this, that in order for us to move forward, in order to reform, with all the good suggestions made by our fellow panelists just now, we must address the elephant in the room. For example, I think institutions must be strengthened when it comes to distribution. what we are facing today, the leakages year in, year out on the Auditor General's report, must be addressed urgently. But the problem is the antidote to these issues does not lie with the government alone. It rests in politics, because the politicians like us are the ones manning the executives. And as we are running or gearing for GE15, as what Pakatan Harapan has outlined in the MOU, there's an urgent need to debate about our financial political funding legislation. I'm not sure whether we have the time or not to debate in Parliament in next sitting, but if this thing has not or cannot be addressed, whatever reforms we're trying to make or institutionalize, as what we discussed just now, will bear no fruit in coming futures. This is why I believe, when I quote Arnold Toynbee just now, the moral fiber of the society must be addressed, and this has to do with politics first rather than economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, YB Wan Ahmad Fayhsal. Now we will move on to this open discussion where both of you, all three debaters can cross-examine. I'd like to sincerely invite YB Kelvin Yee to ask a question to any one of the other debaters.
Thank you so much. I think I'll address first to Saudara Wan Fayhsal. On the speech of economy, you made a lot of political rhetoric. Look, I understand the importance of good governance, but what is your view? Is the economic framework and policies moving forward that we need?
Okay. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What is, in short, what is your economic policy?
Yeah. Okay. We are living in, thank you first and foremost, Dr. Kelvin. We are living in a post-COVID era where it is regarded by many of our economists and historians as unprecedented in our generation. Definitely, if you were to ask me the way forward, I would agree with Brother Shahril. We need to spend big in order to secure our future. What does it mean by that? I think we cannot be too reliant on our traditional revenue-generating institutions like Petronas, our commodities. And what worries me the most is that the greatest asset Malaysia ever has is the human capital. But despite of having such assets or population, we could see that the trend is not encouraging enough, especially when we face post-COVID era. And I believe some of the most important economic policy or reform that has to be made is basically to recalibrate our supply and demand in labor market. I think this has to do with the introduction of a very crucial council called Majlis Pekerjaan Negara and also Majlis Tivet Negara, where both were institutionalized before by the Prime Minister Tan Sri Muda Yassin. So I would like to position that as my first policy to address post-COVID challenge.
Right. Thank you so much, YB Wan Ahmad Fayhsal. Back to you, Kelvin Yee, if you have any response or anything.
Do I ask another question or do I respond to that?
You respond to that.
Okay. I guess same. Listening to what you are asking. Again, we need long-term, short-terms, concrete, and consistent policies. What you said has been said many times, but then not done properly. And actually, I want to pivot this question even to Shahril. He has mentioned good economic frameworks, and I agree in general in principle. However, even in our day-to-day, as the governor today, the question is, have they done enough to address the inflation and also economic costs? In my view, no. What has been done is a lot of whitewashing, a lot of window dressing, a lot of populist stunts, like giving free 1 month, what's that? Kereta api. Public transportations, forming committees after committees, jihad after jihad ni. But trust me, and I said, I've not heard a sound policy proposal by a committee which I do not understand why is it led by a communications minister. what's wrong with the KPD and HEP minister. So again, now a lot of the announcements are, oh kita tunggulah harga akan turun, saya harap penjual tidak akan naikkan. So it's a lot on hoping world international markets drop. But there is no short-term, mid-term, long-term and consistent policies which investors really can look at. Could both of you respond to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, YB. See, I find I'm struggling to understand how a country that's spending 78 billion ringgit on subsidies, highest ever, a country and a government administration that is subsidizing more than half of RON 95 petrol, a country that is subsidizing chicken production, and someone says that it's not affecting lives of people. So I think I would take issue with that. The fact of the matter is, yes, we all in different ways have said what the systemic long-term issues are. But to suggest and to posit that the government isn't doing enough or the government isn't intervening enough that actually helps the people's situation, I think is completely false. Because if, for example, you got to look at it the counterfactual. What if government did not subsidize chicken prices? What if government doesn't subsidize RON 95? What if government does not assist with the grants and the loans and the soft loans that are given to agricultural producers? I think what you got to see is inflation rate will not be 3.4%, it will be 9%, 10%, or even in the teens. So there are real consequences from what the government is doing. It may not be the sexiest, it may not appear to be the most systemic and structural, but as you hinted yourself, we need short-term measures, we need immediate tactical actions that solve today's problems. At the same time, parallel to that, we do things that will move and shift this economy forward in the long term. So I would, in short, I don't agree and I don't accept that the government doesn't have a plan, because the government has intervened and has helped reduce the cost of living pressures on people. And in broader terms, the long-term issues and the long-term plans is where I think my party is best positioned compared to the other two on this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Saudara Shahril, for your answer. Now I would like to invite Saudara Shahril to give his questions to any of the debaters, if he has any.
Yeah, I'm going to give Waf a break and return the favor to Kelvin. You see, YB, you came after me for saying that the current administration isn't doing enough, and I contested that. But I guess to you, I'm always curious what exactly Pakatan Harapan's revenue-generating policies are. When you were in power, there was a lot of talk about trying to save money and trying to be more prudent and austere. But in recent times, your Pakatan Harapan Presidential Council proposed to reduce the price of RON 95, still the same promise lah, which is that hari ni menang esok minyak turun, and to give out, and you push government to give out more subsidies. So let's not argue whether that's the right thing or not. My question is very simple. What exactly is PH's revenue policy that makes it mathematically possible for you to promise these large subsidies and large spending on the part of government?
Thank you, Shahril. Thank you so much for that question. And before I answer the question, I'd like to respond. When you talk about government doing enough in terms of subsidy and controlling the inflation prices, the fact of the matter is, but again, that's very short term. What is the long-term plan to be done? And if, as the government of the day, why can't the minister actually spell out how do you address, for example, food security? Like short-term plans that has long-term repercussions, stopping the export of chicken to Singapore and to outside. Now they are diversifying. We have lost a huge market. We have probably lose a huge market in Singapore. Again, short-term policies, long-term repercussions. So the perception is there is no plan, you are only acting one-on-one, on one cases to one case basis. To answer your question, one of the most, as I said, I started the whole debate and discussion, that the cancer in our country is corruption. There's so much leakages. Pakatan Harapan in its short tenure has introduced fundamental anti-corruption measures. If you do not recognize it, international index, for example, the CPI recognizes it. We have saved money by cutting costs, by implementing open tender, and this has saved billions which could be pumped into the economy. AG reports, international reports have said that we have lost up to 47 billion due to leakages and wastage. All those could be used to pump into the economy. I know on a short term, I understanding there is a need for more spending, and there's probably a need for borrowing. I'm actually personal, it's not PH. I just think we may look at the laws to even increase our debt, especially when we are facing a recession. My philosophy is recession is not the time to be stingy, but it's a time to spend. When it comes to what Ketua Pembangkang said, that is sometimes political rhetoric, but if you look at our PH manifesto, it is clearly stated what has been addressed, how can we address, and indeed, actually, when we took over, the price of petrol was kept lower than it was before. So we did reduce petrol price at that time, but we have a long sustainable plan, and given the chance, we will set in fundamentals, cut out leakages, and find good opportunities with low interest borrowings to address these issues and make sure people have food to put on the table. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, YB, Kelvin. Shahril, do you want to answer? Do you have a response to that, or?
Yeah, my response is that this seems awfully familiar because whenever you ask Pakatan their revenue policy, the answer is always cut leakages. And Kelvin mentioned, and I'll take your word for it, and I'm sure you're right, 47 billion. 47 billion saved, presumably over a long period of time. Our subsidy bill is 78 billion. So if you're going to say we're going to reduce petrol prices, if you're saying we're going to give all sorts of fancy, nice stuff to people, if you say we're going to give free education or whatever it is your Pakatan Harapan manifesto will be in the next few months, you've got to do better than say cut leakages, because 47 billion doesn't cut it. You've got to have a proper revenue plan. You cut GST. You cancel projects like HSR. You thought you would save money but end up bayar pampasan. This is the problem in Pakatan Harapan's thing. Their entire operations is to demonize Barisan Nasional, make it as if we are not fit to govern, but when they actually have the keys to power, look at what they actually did in 22 months. They cut assistance. They give only 50 ringgit more in minimum wage. And Kelvin, before you tell me you got to compare apples and apples, 22 months, 60 tahun dah BN dah rosakkan negara, sometimes it doesn't matter whether it's 22 months ke, 22 hari ke, 22 tahun ke, it's what you do in a time in power that matters. And actually certain actions show who you actually are. And those are the things that Pakatan Harapan did, and that is why, even if there is a credibility problem and a corruption image problem with my party, which I admit and we've got to improve, in the end, in the election, we'll still win because we are the one credible enough to run this country.
Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our first part, this first segment of the question on inflation. We will now be moving on to a fundamental part of the Malaysian political system, which is the second part of the second segment. Race has been a dominant aspect of Malaysian politics since the inception of our motherland. Political parties are still largely race-based or dominated by a single race. My question, gentlemen, is this. Practically, are race-based parties still needed to represent or protect the interests of their respective races? Why are we perpetuating this notion, this idea, that only a Malay can protect the Malay community, that only a Chinese can protect the Chinese community, and that only an Indian can protect the Indian community? Is it time to do away with race-based political parties? I would first like to invite YB Wan Ahmad Fayhsal to give his 4-minute remark.
There has been a remark made by various parties in the past 20 years that the triumph of liberal democracy and the end of Cold War will spell the end of history, of course, famously argued by Fukuyama. But as we have observed lately, despite the world or democracy throughout the world is moving away from so-called race-based, identity-based politics, it came with a vengeance. But this time around would be different because it comes with a package called populism. The rise of Trump, Viktor Orban, and others, strongmen in Western democracy, shows that you cannot deny the basic structure of human politics rests on racial and religious identity. With that, I also would like to conclude Malaysia, being a nascent post-colonial country, still has to navigate through the remnants of British divide and rule policy. We are still stuck in the communal mindset across all sectors. But of course, that does not mean we cannot transcend that in our politics. When it comes to governing the country, we all need each other. Hence, coalition-based politics would normally taper off and temper such influence or such stigma. And I believe, moving forward, definitely race-based parties or politics will remain relevant. But for the sake of salvaging our future, there are many issues and challenges that require us to go beyond such notions. When it comes to, for example, improving our governance, creating more jobs, creating more prosperity, I fully support anything or any policies that subscribe or hinges on need-based policy. But without also denying the fact there still need such policy or affirmative action in that matter, which targeted based on racial needs, whether it's for Malay, Indian, Chinese, Sarawakian, Sabahan, doesn't matter, because justice rests on such notion as well. And the issue at hand is this: how do we ensure race-based politics remain palatable and also tolerable to everyone? Of course, one cannot weaponize racial and religious issues just in order to garner votes. I'm not accusing UMNO or Bersatu, I'm accusing DAP as well. We all know DAP being, despite calling themselves a democratic party or socialist-based party, the support rests mainly based on certain particular race in this country. And if you were to study the rhetorics played by some of the leaders, not all of the leaders, we could see they also perpetuate race-based politics despite denying or asking for a more egalitarian approach in politics. So that's where I rest my case.
Thank you, YB. I would now like to invite Saudara Shahril Hamdan to deliver his 4-minute remark.
Thank you. This is a tough topic for anyone to speak of. What works best for Malaysia when it comes to race and politics, to me, is what actually works. And I mean that in a literal sense, in the sense that we can't speak of race and politics as if we are, and Waf will appreciate this since, he drops philosopher names all the time. We can't talk of it like, behind a veil of ignorance like John Rawls. We don't exist in that situation. We exist in this particular reality. And in this reality, race matters and race consciousness exists in this country. For me, really, when I think about it, for 2 reasons. One, because of our history. When I say history, generally speaking, how we got independence, sort of the quid pro quo agreement that we all understand and we all read in history. Sejarah menyebabkan race is weaved into our consciousness and into our constitution. But the second reason race consciousness matter, and this is where it's more important to me, is where it touches social justice. Not everything about social justice is racial, just to be clear, but some elements of it, some dimensions of it, is articulated and is understood via the lens of race. So, for example, when you have a situation where a Bumiputra graduate is less likely to earn the same amount as a non-Bumiputra graduate, I think there is an ethnic and racial element to that question of justice. And I gave a Bumiputra example. Somebody who's not Bumiputra can give a non-Bumiputra example where there's an ethnic dimension to inequality and inequality of opportunity. That, to me, is the limit of race consciousness that political parties should operate on. If, and I agree with Wafir, if you start weaponizing race for political ends, and every one of us, or rather every party represented on this stage has been guilty of that, then I think we are doing a disservice to the future of Malaysia. My parents are here and my mother is Chinese. So I speak from a very personal place when I say that race consciousness in Malaysian politics exists because of our history and because of the question of social justice. It should not dominate everything that we do. And I'm an UMNO guy. I'm Naib Ketua Pemuda UMNO. And I say in every public forum that I can, that while I memperjuangkan kepentingan Melayu, it should be only limited to the point where it exists within a Malaysian story. So my concern is, how do I ensure that there are more Malay professionals? My concern is, how do I ensure that gaji dan pendapatan orang Melayu lebih tinggi daripada sekarang? My concern is, how do I make sure that in the VC space, for example, and in startup space, there are more Malays who get opportunities? My concern is how the Malays and Bumiputras exist in a transition economy where we want to go more into the green economy. That's my concern. It is not so that I feel that, you know, I have to win. For Malays to win, non-Malays will have to lose. So that, I think, is the scope through which young Malaysians should exist or should talk about racial politics in a way that's not offensive, in a way that is magnanimous, in a way that does not justify any question of supremacy, because this is a country for all races. We all have a stake in this country, and just because we live and we exist in our own ethnic community does not preclude the fact that we want success for all Malaysians. Thank you.
Thank you, Saudara Shahril. I would like now to invite YB Kelvin Yee to deliver his 4-minute remark.
Thank you so much. I just want to respond a little bit to Shahril regarding the previous point he made. In terms of Pakatan, when I'm saying I'm not comparing apple to apple, I'm comparing in the sense that you cannot judge a 5-year report card in 2 years. In those 2 years, fundamentals were set, which needs time to bear fruit. I can say it, and it's not just us praising ourselves, international ratings, in terms of transparency perception, corruption index, democratic index, free press, it all increased. And you know very well, with fundamentals right, and good governance, anti-corruptions, things will be better after 5 years. But when back to the topic of politics of race, I like to take a different angle on this argument, because I strongly believe the core disease or the core problem is actually economic anxieties and social insecurities. You see, the prominence of politics of race will somehow lessen if we address such anxieties. Of course, people tend to place race in terms of inequality. But when it is actually an issue of class, we have rich Malays, rich Chinese, poor Chinese, rich Indians, poor Indians, so on and so forth. Due to systemic and institutional issues, abuse of power, laws that have not been reviewed when it doesn't achieve its target, we have seen small groups of elites benefit, line up their pockets at the expense not just of the minorities, but the majority. And this is where we need to holistically address these inequalities and economic anxieties. And this can take form in universal interventionist policies, unemployment benefits, minimum wage, that cut across race and ethnicity. In terms of affirmative actions, we have to look at economic and political realities. I'm not against it, especially if it achieves its target. But what I'm proposing and putting forth, that it can be expanded to address those that are economically vulnerable and the disabled. And these are things that we need to look at And this focus of this policy should be oriented towards building capabilities, self-reliance, and eventually graduating from such affirmative actions. I myself do not believe in race politics. I understand the reality of Malaysian politics. I'm not naive. But I could not in good conscience continue to perpetrate such notions, be part of such parties. I believe I live in Sarawak. The city that I represent is Kuching, and we are known as the City of Unity. It is not because we are colorblind. I actually hate that term. But it's because we accept the spectrum of all colors and diversity. That is where, moving forward, we need to strengthen a Malaysian ethnic identity. It's not a monolithic one, but a plural diversity. We need to treat all cultures, Hari Raya ke, Tahun Baru Cina ke, as our celebrations. And this includes harnessing the strength and the gold mine of language in Malaysia. So for me, politics should be about policies and agenda based, framed around this Malaysian identity. We need to build a Malaysian identity by the famous quote of Datuk Seri Anwar. Anak Melayu, anak saya. Anak Iban, anak saya. Anak Cina juga anak saya. And based on yesterday's announcement, that actually literally came true. Thank you so much.
Thank you, YB. YB, now I would like to invite you to ask a question if you have any, to any of the debaters.
Maybe I'll just start with Saudara Waf. Many months ago, you mentioned that we need to accept that race politics is here to stay in Malaysia. As a young leader, why do you take that position? Wouldn't you want to change? Wouldn't you want to frame a different social norm? And again, I'm not saying it to deny our cultural identity, our heritage, but especially you in a position of a deputy unity minister. Shouldn't you be the forefront of changing this and including denying rights to minorities and even non-Bumiputras?
Thank you, Dr. Kelvin, for asking me such question, which is paramount for us to address in this debate. Definitely, the ideal state that we like to achieve as a nation is to really have a mono identity that really carries what Malaysian is all about. But as we all know, Malaysia's setup is quite different than our neighbors, for example, Indonesia. We do not practice forced assimilation. And the strength of our country when it comes to race-based politics is that we do respect each other's privileges and also institutions that protect their identities. And the reality that we have to accept is that the efforts are there to address and to create, to unite people on the basis of being Malaysian. But there's a parallel and communal channel or another dimension of our day-to-day lives where we are basically separated. I used to go to a daily school, a national school when I was in primary, where I had wonderful multiracial friends and classmates. But as I progressed further to secondary school and also universities, yes, I still have such friends, but the social interaction has become lesser. And this, I believe, has to do with our inability to foster meaningful exchanges, dialogue, in our national language. And we have to create such forum in order for us to foster such interactions. And that's why I believe government is trying to do with our level best, with Keluarga Malaysia, with National Unity Department and others.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, YB. Now I would like to invite Saudara Shahril if you have a question.
Yeah. Me directed to YB Kelvin. We used and we're familiar with this debate about whether you are this first or that first. You know, your chairman Lim Guan Eng once said that he's Malaysian first and Chinese second. Waf says he's Malay first and Malaysian second. Do you think it's healthy and useful to speak in these terms where you start ranking different parts of identity, or do you think there's a more productive way to speak about this issue?
Thank you so much, Shahril, for that question. And I agree with you. It is not a productive way of answering or even framing a question. Why can't I be a Malaysian and a Chinese first? Being a Malaysian does not mean, and I disagree with, a mono-ethnic, mono-single identity. But it can be a plural identity of being Malaysian. So instead of ranking, instead of looking at the lens, and Saudara Shahril, I'm sorry, I disagree when you talk about being part of UMNO politics. You are just looking at the Malay in the context of Malaysia as a whole. But I would like to shift, try to challenge especially young people to shift their mindset to look at needs. Because as I said, this is not an issue of race. A lot of it is an issue of class, issue of discrimination, oppression of class. And this is the inequality that we have to address. So again, to answer your question, I would like to reframe the question. Rather than, are you first this or second that? But how do you define yourself as Malaysian? How do you celebrate yourself as Malaysian? What is Malaysian pluralistic, multiculturalism, multi-religion all about? And trust me, that is our strength. We are at the gold mine of world economy due to our culture, due to our multilinguistic abilities. Let us harness that, let us focus on that rather than the issues that we have.
All right, thank you, YB Kelvin. I would like to now invite YB Ahmad Fayhsal if you have a question.
I would like to address Brother Shahril. We are from the same, basically, ideological party in terms of our Malay nationalism. I mean, UMNO and Bersatu, we are almost the same.
No.
Okay.
You admitted you jumped. You finally admitted it.
But let us be honest as Malay. As much as you want to progress further, I know, I mean, here on stage, we could be some progressive or different breed of Malay leaders that hopefully you could do some changes in our people. But we are still facing a very critical issue, the crisis of Malay politics. The issue of governance, corruption, rests on the problem of politics of patronage, that which I believe has become so rampant in our Malay society. As a leader of UMNO, how do you plan to address this?
Yeah. If Bersatu and UMNO is very similar, maybe you should close off Bersatu and... But I'll address the question. Facing this issue of crisis of Malay politics, specifically patronage. See, I've read some of your stuff, which, sometimes is interesting. And I've seen you go through mental gymnastics trying to explain how there's Malay custodianship and, Malays need protectors. And I'm sorry, but it really seemed to me that you were apologizing for essentially a feudalist system that we as young Malay politicians need to change. So I would not try and understand, or I would not try and justify or explain as to why, UMNO needs to exist because only UMNO can help Malays. That is something that some party colleagues of mine say, but inshallah, you will never hear me say it. Because I want Malays to support UMNO, not just because they're Malays. I want Malays to support UMNO because UMNO has the best policies for Malays and for Malaysia. So, I don't know, Waf. If you think in that paradigm and you think in that feudalist way, then maybe that's another reason why we are not the same. But if I can persuade you, as a young politician, as a deputy unity minister, you got to think a different way of Malay politics. We've got to talk to our Malay constituency in a different language, in a way that doesn't scare them, doesn't fearmonger, but persuades them to support our parties based on a positive idea, not a scary, negative, defensive idea. So that's how I would imagine the future of Malay politics, and I think it's far more positive, and that's why tak payahlah Bersatu tutup je lah masuk UMNO.
Thank you, Saudara Shahril. I would like to invite YB Waf if he has a response to that.
Definitely, I made my stand on this issue. I just addressed that the issue of, say, for example, Malay needs protector as something that exists in our society. But definitely, I concur with Brother Shahril here. We can afford to have this kind of mentality moving forward when it comes to creating a better future for the nation. Because challenges are plenty, and that require us to transcend race-based consideration. And as much as you like to explain about the need for Bersatu to close down, I think I let the next general election will determine the fate of both parties. And what I like to address or point about is that the problem lingers in our country today is because Malay politics is in crisis. As long as the Malays are divided, as long as the Malays cannot address some of the fundamental issues in our the moral decay that we are facing among our leaders, the crisis of our leaders, we will never come out from this dilemma that we are facing, and the country can never be stable. Stable, yes, you can achieve stability as what you've been championed about, but at what cost? As I said just now, I might not be popular in addressing this, but the issues, the elephant in the room when it comes to Malay politics, the identity, the patronage is still there. All the cases involve 1MDB. I know it's not your fault, but it has to do with the way we Malays conduct our politics. And this needs a drastic change, which I believe is a common cause for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, YB1 Ahmad Fayhsal. Now we'll move on to the last topic of this segment, which is on, well, it's a topic for the future. It's climate change. Now, Malaysia has witnessed one of the worst floods this year, and it tested our government and civil society's capacity to respond. Now, the rate of climate change is extremely worrying, but moreover, the absence of any robust action is even more concerning. In light of our government's commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, the question I have to, I guess, the debaters today is, what is your plan to help Malaysia reach carbon neutrality by 2050? Is it turning to nuclear, investing into renewable energies like solar, or maybe even divesting away from palm oil? I'd like to invite YB Kelvin Yee for his 4-minute speech.
Thank you so much. You mentioned just now this is an issue for the future. It is not. It is an issue for today, because what we do today will affect our future. Malaysia is the signatory for the Paris Agreement, and our NDC, or National Determined Commitment, was to achieve a 45% reduction in carbon emission intensity by 2030 relative to 2005 level. So, to break down, it was 35% unconditional, another 10% conditional upon, of course, international support, terms of financing and capacity building. Recently, the government actually announced that Malaysia's NDC is unconditional 45%. I personally see two main weaknesses in such a target. Why? And it can be improved, especially in the next review of the NDC. Number one, we should retain this 10% of conditional reduction on top of the 45% of unconditional to push developed countries to do more. There is joint responsibility in this, and we need to stand firm in our principle of climate justice. Number two, Malaysia should really consider using other measurements than carbon intensity in submitting our NDCs. Actually, there are fewer than 10 countries in the world that uses this, and Malaysia is one of them. This is because carbon intensity reduction target does not incentivize the adoption of low carbon practices and technologies. So by setting that target, I think there is much for us to improve on. What is my proposal? What can we do? We know generally there are two aspects of climate change actions. Mitigation, which is trying to reduce carbon, and of course adaptation on how to adapt to the changes due to climate change. It is important for us to have a common national climate goal and direction. And in order to have that, we need a centralized agency to coordinate all actions, climate actions, by different segments of society, different agencies, and different governments. This has been actually mentioned since 2009, based on public records. But Pakatan Harapan government, under the stewardship of YB made talks into action and first formed the Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Center, which was launched in 2019. This is important, as I said, to coordinate policies among different ministries, to establish a roadmap of climate change in our country, to undertake data collection, run climate change risk analysis, and of course, to enhance R&D in terms of green tech development. This is the first step towards addressing climate change issues. What's next? Legislation changes have to happen. A climate change act has to be enacted in Malaysia, just like in the UK, France, and New Zealand. This is to ensure continuity in climate action, regardless of which political party in power. Basically, what this act makes is that the government is binded to the country's target of net zero, as well as to binded to climate change adaptation to reduce climate change-related risks or issues or climate-related opportunities. So we need to develop institutional framework for mitigation and adaptation. Flooding is an adaptation issue, and we have seen one of the main problems in our country's adaptation. There is way too many ministries, it is way too fragmented, there's way too many bureaucracies. Let us build all in one. Let's build one environmental ministry which handles all, and this is done in the UK, in Japan, in China. Right now there's CASA, there's KETSA, there is local government that handles waste management. It is so messy. If we treat ministries, ministerial portfolios as political rewards, this is what happens. During Pakatan Harapan time, not only we put talk into action, we had one woman who handled it all. And this has to happen. We need good governance and we need proper bureaucracy in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, YB Kelvin. Now over to YB1 Ahmad Fayhsal for your 4-minute speech.
When it comes to climate change, we must view this issue from a more holistic point of view. It's not a solitary Malaysian issue or national issue. In fact, in order to combat or to reduce the carbon footprint or to mitigate any crisis, climate change related crisis, it requires a collaborative effort regionally and internationally. And one of the major things that I must agree with Dr. Kelvin on the aspect of having a climate change act from the government to show our commitment. But what can be done at our local level is that I think on top of producing, securing our food supplies, is to really, for government to unlock various potentials and also reduce all the structural impediment to create more self-sufficient and sustainable local economy. What I mean by that is that, for example, if we were to allow, which I think government is addressing, most of our food being imported from abroad, definitely that contribute much to the problems of climate change, regionally and internationally. But by having a more locally based produce, by having incentives, loans, and also cooperatives, I think we can really start a new way of sustainable economic production. And we all know that when it comes to regional and international instability that what we are facing in Ukraine and Russia, when it comes to war, in fact, the future escalation in this region, the government cannot rely solely by importing food. Wakaf land, for example, which being administered by religious bodies at the state level must come together and pull their acts together and find ways to allow more people to participate in utilizing those abandoned lands. And I believe this can be facilitated by having proper federal and state level engagements, which I believe currently ongoing. And it will definitely usher a new way of doing things in addressing climate change. Of course, the issues of deforestation is a very critical one, which I personally agree that it has to be reduced remarkably in order to secure us from ever impending danger such as massive flooding that had never occurred before, for example, last year. It could be contributed to deforestation, but also there could be more proper projects implementation when it comes to irrigation and when it comes to building highways and buildings. Local authorities must plan better in order and take into account the impact of such designs to our climate sustainability. And this, I believe, must be one of the major important discussion policy points for upcoming GE15, and it has to be cross-bipartisan and transcend political affiliation in order to make it work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, YB. Saudara Shahril Hamdan, your 4-minute speech, please.
Yeah, isn't it? It's ironic that this is the last section of the debate, but it's also the most important. And, you know, we've traded blows and politics is the contact sport. And we talk about race and we talk about this and that, but what is the point of race if in 150 years most of us will be dead? And not to sound overly alarmist, but there are real data, there's real evidence showing that this is the biggest existential threat for humanity. And it doesn't matter if, you know, whatever race, religion you are, this is the biggest issue facing our generation. And especially personally to me, I have a 4-year-old daughter. I hear Waf has just gotten a child as well. And that is where our entire conversation has to be about. It's about ensuring the next generation doesn't actually face mortal threat because of climate crisis and because of climate change. So that's a big statement. What do we as Malaysia, one small country, do to fix it? We're not going to be able to fix it on our own, but there are measures that we need to be doing. For me, the biggest theme here is bagaimana nak merakyatkan respon kepada krisis iklim. Merakyatkan. It has to be relatable. Right now, we have all these grand targets about, you know, COP26, our minister went and said that we'll reduce it by X, but his own ministry doesn't use electric vehicle. You know, I've got to be honest here, and this is, again, I agree, this is not a partisan point. This is a wake-up call for all of us on the stage and the ones not in this room even, about how we need a whole-of-society approach that begins with making it relatable. And for me, making it relatable is around this particular small idea I have. And it's not my idea, but it's basically a sense of how do we make sure carbon trading and carbon credit become something that even normal citizens can be a part of. You know, I just spoke to this fantastic guys from Johor, EcoRide. They're a company that basically leases electric vehicles to customers and to companies to reduce their carbon footprint. That's just one step and nobody knows about it, and there is no way to get invested in it as a normal citizen. My sense is we need to get to a point where, even as regular citizens, we change our behaviors and carbon trading and carbon credit becomes a currency that actually matters. So imagine, Kevin, if instead of coming here via Grab, we cycle here, or instead of using an ICE car, we actually use an EV. We sell on that carbon credit to a local council, which is something that Johor is actually starting to do. And that state or that council sells onto a national or international market. That entire infrastructure, I'm sorry to say, does not exist today. I have no clue what the current thinking is in terms of people in power, both at state and federal level, and what they actually intend to do to get to a point where we can have this carbon trading system, which, like I said, is cascading all the way from the top to the normal citizen level. So I feel that this is it's not, it's clearly not a oven-ready solution, but carbon trading and carbon credit is for me how we begin to merakyatkan perubahan iklim. And if we can do that in the next 5 to 10 years, and we can be non-partisan about this, and we can really think about the future, I think that's where we can contribute to a safer and better generation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Now we'll move on to the questions. Saudara Shahril, Hamdan, do you have any questions for any of the debaters?
So I think this part is not really about being aggressive or belligerent. I think I just want to ask the same question to both. Like, if you could pick one or two things to do immediately in the next 1 or 2 years, what would it be? On climate change and climate crisis, neither one can go first.
Well, for me, I think there's a dearth of interaction and engagement with our religious institutions when it comes to promoting solutions at the local level. When our ustaz and ulama do not talk about this at the mosque or schools, as we all know how influential they are in the society, at least in the Malay society, we will definitely not gaining the possible traction as what Shahril has promoted, which is merakyatkan issue climate change. Because we have been used to live in a very modern way of lifestyle. We live in a very energy-intensive environment. But in the past, I think our forefathers had a better green and sustainable living, which not only for the Malays, but also for other traditions. So the only thing that I would do is to really engage our religious leaders to promote that issues from the Islamic point of view, and perhaps in other religious institutions like Buddhism and Christianity. I'm sure there are wealth of information and arguments and solutions from such a group of people.
I think the first thing I'll do is what I mentioned just now. It's a Climate Change Act. In 2019, the Pakatan Harian government set a 2-year target for it to be tabled. It is actually not that hard because we have good models from the UK especially, and they were working professional relationships with the UK government to help the Malaysian government set up this act. We need to bind and legislate actions on climate change. Number two that I would really want to do, and I want to pivot it to this, is to stimulate the green economy and creating sustainable jobs for Malaysians. As you can see in the 3 topics, the main underlying theme I want to address is it comes down to jobs, jobs, and jobs. So you see, a low carbon is an ambitious plan. It is a morally good plan, but it is also a good commercial plan to generate for economy. We need to show people that in RE and in EE, that is economic and commercial sense for our future generations, for our young people to have a viable commercial field even in climate change. And that is my view, how we can merakyatkan climate change, because when you make it mainstream, you make it sustainable, and you make it good for the economy and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the debaters. Now, I'll now like to invite YB Wan Ahmad Fayhsal to ask a question to any one of the debaters.
What are your opinions, both panelists, on Malaysia going nuclear?
What, sorry?
Malaysia going nuclear power. Having our first nuclear power plant as part of our energy mix to secure a more cleaner and sustainable energy supply.
Yeah, I have to admit this is not something that I'm particularly well versed in. Off the bat, not for it, personally, for the same reasons that, we worry about obviously the implications and the safety concerns whenever nuclear generation is in conversation. But I don't feel super strongly about it, Waf, because I don't know enough about it. But I think I want to use the opportunity to say, if we don't go nuclear, what do we do to reduce our emissions in electricity generation? Because that's the main question. And my sense is, Kelvin, you in Parliament, I wonder if there's a way Parliament can push for early decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. How much would it cost, I imagine it's expensive, but, instead of spending on the stuff that maybe is not the best use of our resources and our government funds, why not use the model where we basically pay off IPPs early, retire the coal-fired power plants, don't worry about our reserve margin, because then we can put online solar energy and renewable energy. That's my sense as somebody who's not fully well-versed. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, especially in Parliament. Is there an appetite across parties to basically retire coal-fired power plants faster?
Again, to be fully honest, to answer that question, that conversation has not been brought up to public. And the fact of the matter, I think in Parliament we have room for improvement, especially to increase our climate change discourse. I think not many MPs, to be fair, have, of course, the expertise, the appetite to discuss on what is needed, especially on this existential crisis. To answer Waf, I'm against nuclear, and if you look at the trend around the world, they're actually moving away from nuclear to other renewable energies, where there is hydro, and now the big trend is, to a certain extent, hydrogen technology. Solar is technology in Malaysia. We have some projects that have been done. Of course, again, I'm not an expert of the field. Ask me something about healthcare and I'll go on rambling. But they are alternatives, and if we look at trends around international market especially, they're moving away. There is a reason why they're moving away, and I think there are more ways that we can explore. But on Shahril's suggestion, I think I would suggest to Parliament, and I'll speak to the Speaker, to really have an environmental select committee so that we have robust discussions on climate actions, robust discussion on climate policies, and get this act passed, because we have been procrastinating for too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Now, on to the final question. I'd like to invite YB Kelvin Yee to ask one question to any of the debaters.
As I said, I think the next step, we have taken the first step to form a centralized agency. Now we need to centralize a ministry. Next, we need to pass an act. As I said, it is a low-lying fruit. Countries have done it. We have good models. In your capacity as both in your parties and your political leadership, what would you do to further this agenda?
Shall I go first? So I think what I will answer is contained in my introductory remarks already, just to reiterate. And I completely agree with you about jobs. Once you have an ecosystem that has carbon credit in the middle of it, and it is part of our education system, it is part of how people think of wealth and investment, it is part of how people behave, then I think you get to a point where the entire country is invested. I think it's also telling that this room's energy fell down when we started talking about climate crisis. So even among the younger generation, we've got to do better, Kelvin and Waf, because it is not something that people seem to be excited about, passionate about, because it's not as news-making as some things. But I think once you start telling them, if you invest in this kind of action, you get carbon credits, which you can sell overseas and you boleh kaya. Then I think people start to get interested in it. But that's the part where I think the ecosystem has not started, and if we can begin it at our generation and our level, then I think we've done something great for this country.
Yeah, as for me, I would like to, of course, you are going from the parliamentary channel to reform or institute a solution, but I think some low-hanging fruits that I think we can do or promote on bipartisan basis is that to persuade the government to include or reform our GLC, GLIC's social mandates by focusing on this aspect. I mean, we do have a lot of funds that can be tapped for our entrepreneurs, our startups in climate change that could offer some solutions. And I believe if we have a clearer picture or framework for this, we can really popularize the solutions further without waiting for government to create an act. Yeah.
Thank you to our speakers. We will now be moving on to the third segment, ladies and gentlemen. However, due to time constraints, the Q&A will be cut short to only 10 minutes. We will now open the floor to members of the audience to ask your question. To ask a question, please kindly line up behind the microphone stands located at designated areas in the room. You may ask your question when called upon. Please state to whom your question is directed. Keep it concise, without any follow-ups. I'd like to welcome the first question from this gentleman over here, on my right. Yep.
Hi, hello. Is Ismail here. So I have one question that it was specially created for Saudara Shahril Hamdan. So I do really hope that you can provide some sorts of impeccable answers to me. So Saudara Shahril, you were probably the first Malaysian public figure to bring up MMT as a theory to deal with or to consult with the economy. So it basically always associated with the printing out more money. So is it true, or is it just a gross or just a simple simplification on that? And if not, then what exactly is all about? And the last question from me is how will your understanding differ from YB Wolf, who has directly or publicly proposed direct helicopter money to the people? Thank you. So that's my question.
Gentlemen, any of you want to go first? Or was it? Yep.
Sure. So answer straight away.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. The question was MMT and how I differ from one Fayhsal who wants to print money. So I think first and foremost, this stuff is quite technical. Economics is quite a celebrated discipline, and people spend years and years of research. And even then, things are nuanced, things are complicated. There's no black and white answer. And so I want to keep this as simple as possible. For me, there's two parts to MMT. So for people who don't know MMT is modern monetary theory. You can just Google it later. There's two parts. To me, there's the descriptive part and the prescriptive part. MMT to me describes government's financing and how government funds its expenditure in the most accurate manner, in my opinion. We cannot think of government spending in the same way we think of household spending. In a household spending, like you and me, our expenditure is limited by our income. If you want to spend more than you earn, you will have to borrow, and later on you have to pay back that borrowings anyway with interest. So in the end, your spending is limited by your earning potential or your income. Jap, benda ni kena panjang ni, buat tidak? So what does that mean? It means in a household you are limited by your income. But government doesn't work that way. Government works in a way where government does not actually, his spending power is not actually limited by tax revenues. Now this sounds controversial, but it's descriptively true. Why? Because government is the issuer of money. So government who issues debt in its own currency can never be bankrupt. So that's a description of MMT that is true. That is technically true. Even COVID shows that Keynes's quote is always correct, which is that whatever we can actually do, we can afford. But the prescription is where we have to be careful. Because I don't agree with my friend here that you can just simply say print money and everything will be okay. If economics is about printing money, then tak payah belajar lah jauh-jauh. Memang macam tu selesai masalah. It's what you spend on that matters. And you have to spend on increasing productive capacity. Because if you spend simply to get people more money in their pockets, but the goods and services don't improve, don't increase in value, what will happen? Inflation. Because inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. But if government spends and pump primes the economy, increases the productive capacity, does stuff that actually increases our supply side, then you mitigate the risk of inflation. So in short, MMT explains how government financing works, but the real world warns me that if we have that knowledge, we have to be careful in the kind of words that we use and don't simplify matters until the entire discipline of economics is disrespected or done a disservice. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahril. The next question, I must emphasize, must be directed to either YB Kelvin or YB Waf. I would like to invite the gentleman from the center of the hall, please.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Tazrin, and I would like to ask to YB Wan Fayhsal. YB, during your tenure as a Deputy Minister of Youth and Sports, you have been attacked for your comments regarding on several issues, such as on the vernacular school issues and many more. And now you also have been criticized on your comments regarding on the bond authority issues. So I would like to ask you, how do you balance between your positions or between your capacity as a youth chief of Parti Pribumi Bersatu Malaysia, who is well known as a Malay-centric party, and your current position in the cabinet as a Deputy Minister of Unity? Because for me, most of your stance are divisive. And
Please,
yet,
I apologize. Please get to the question, please.
Yet your position is about, or your portfolio is about unity. How do you balance for both of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Tazrin, for a very sharp question. I think I've answered this quite a few times in the parliament as well. I think it's not an issue for me being a youth chief of a Malay-based party and also as the national deputy minister of national unity and positioning my position as such when it comes to bond authority or the vernacular school. As I said, in Malaysia, we like to speak a lot about problems, but we rarely want to address the elephants in the room. When it comes to the issue of national unity, we have various issues with regard to, for example, vernacular school, with regard to the usage of Bahasa Melayu, the syllabus in our schooling system. So these are the things that if we do not want to discuss, these are sensitive issues, mind you. It could create a lot of controversies, but alas, it's very important. I think I've raised few of those issues either publicly or in my writings or in some of my short comments. And suffice to say, as long as it doesn't contradict the constitution of the country and doesn't wrong the historical narrative of this country, I think all of us have such space to discuss it and find common ground to resolve those. And I think that's where I believe I stand corrected, where my position politically and my government position currently does not contradict with one another. In fact, I believe, being a Malay nationalist myself, I could bring certain angle to such debate where most people tend to sweep it under the carpet. We need to be honest and frank to each other. If not, we can never resolve such issues forever. Thank you.
Thank you, YB. Ladies and gentlemen, the next question is the last question, and it should be directed to YB Kelvin. Any individuals?
Right.
Hello.
Hello. All right.
Okay.
So basically, I want to ask one question to Mr. Kelvin today. Regarding what Wan Fayhsal had said before, so in 2015, he said and quoted, "There is no injunction in the Quran that asks us to unite unless among Muslim." And I don't want to misquote you, so I will play here. So I will play it here.
This is very controversial, but please bear with me. There's never been an injunction in the Quran to ask us to unite, except among Muslims.
So now, I just want to ask Mr. Kelvin, what do you think about having this kind of person who said this on the stage? And yeah, maybe any comment, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question and the very creative way of asking it. I am in no position to comment about a religion or any religion for that matter. But based on the question I asked Saudara Waf at the beginning, as a young leader, as the Deputy Minister of Unity, what is his responsibility? To perpetuate, yes, I understand systemic issues, yes, I understand long-term mindset, to a certain extent narrative, but could he, in his right conscience, continue to be part of it and accepting it as a final eventuality without the need to do something and change it? And that is something I cannot accept. Even if I fail, even if we lose elections, but I'm going to fight for the concept of the multiculturalism and the Malaysian identity, because that is what I see the future of Malaysia. That's what I see the future for you all, a politics that is based on agenda and policies, politics that are based on the people rather than the color of our skin. Thank you so much.
Sir, please.
Thank you, YB. Gentlemen, we have now reached the final segment of the debate. I would first like to invite YB Ahmad Fayhsal to give his 4-minute remark. Yes, to conclude, yes.
We have come to the end of this debate. It's been a very fruitful debate, controversial one, even colorful, in fact. But despite all the noises and colors that we could see and feel, still, I would like to recap what I've said earlier. And yes, I thank you, Brother Shahril, for reminding all of us that we have young kids at home. When I speak about these issues, it's not about scoring political brownie points for my party or for myself. I speak from my heart. I'm very worried. The future is indeed bleak unless we do something or pull our acts together. Being a young politician, we are not being burdened by legacy issues. I believe Brother Shahril can come stronger despite all the issues riddled in his party. He can chart his own course, so does Dr. Kelvin. And in order for us to really address the future of this country, I really would like to encourage all of you, especially the younger ones here, to be part of the solution rather than just a bystander of history. As what Arnold J. Toynbee quoted just now, if a particular nation or civilization fail to address the challenge among its creative minority, it's not the masses actually who resolve the issues. Democracy is a process, but those who provide the solutions are those who are learned and those who are able to come out with a solution that could really capture the imagination and the trust of the people. For example, in Islamic history, even in the Malay history itself, the one who do reforms across the ages are the scholars. And scholars, being the guardian of the Islam religion and Sharia, they would always address the root cause of any problems. I'll give you a good example of Imam Al-Ghazali, the reformer of 11th century. In his time, it was not much different than ours. Corruptions were rife, Mongols were at the gate, the Tatars, and rulers, leaders were corrupted to the core. And it filtered down, trickled down among the people as well. The only way forward for us to resolve this issue is to really restore our moral order. And that is where, as what Arnold J. Toynbee, who used to be agnostic, but came to a conclusion, the only way forward to revive a nation within all this crisis is a spiritual one. And this is where I believe politics is not the only mean to resolve issues. I believe politics is just an institution, one of the institutions that could address such pitfalls. We need to go beyond that. We need to have scholars, teachers, community leaders, NGOs to be part of this. And we cannot move forward without having a clear framework how to restore such moral order. And this is where I believe religion and ethics and education play a paramount role to restore balance for this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, YB. I would now like to invite YB Kelvin Yee, 4 minutes.
Thank you so much. And first and foremost, I would like to thank fellow debaters on this really robust discussion, focused on policies, ideologies, and of course, a way forward for our beloved Malaysia. Fact is, this is what politics is all about. It is not about jostling, fighting for positions, for political rewards or expediency. The people that we are supposed to protect and serve do not care if we politicians have a memorandum of agreement on who the DPM should be. They do not care how many prime ministers we want in a term, but they want to know how they can recover back from this crisis and put food on the table. We need to redeem back politics and make policies and agenda the center of mainstream politics. I have an aspiration to make politics boring again, to focus on policies rather than the drama and the scandal. You see, we have a party that is propagating the notion that we need strong majority for political stability so that investors will have confidence. I myself, I differ in opinion. What investors want is consistency and stability in policies, not a government without accountability. We cannot allow the progress that we have experienced since 2018. We have seen the PAC coming from the opposition, at that time from UMNO, and now from DAP. Who here can say having a PAC from the opposition is a bad thing? We cannot say the progress of having more select committees in Parliament is a bad thing. We cannot let that digress or regress. A party that is asking for huge majority is running a risk of running things without the need for bipartisan politics. One thing we can learn from the MOU that PH signed with the PM is that politics should move beyond winner takes all and loser loses all. Young people, everywhere I go, I always encourage, you guys have a huge role to play in this process. Let us together make politics boring. Investors are looking. The world is looking. What they are looking at is not just parties, but they are looking at consistent policies. We want to build a society that is diamond in shape, a big middle class, to reduce inequality. We want a nation where the young do not have to vote with their feet and run to Singapore, Australia, or the UK to earn a living. We want a nation where university graduates do not have to drive a Grab car. Again, not to say in a condescending way. We want a nation which the young can live a better life than their parents. And for that to happen, friends, we need to work together. And we need a clean and competent and fair, economically fair government for our beloved Malaysia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, YB. Saudara Shahril Hamdan, 4 minutes, concluding remarks.
Sure, I don't know if I'll take up all 4 minutes. I want to thank everyone and the organizers. And I think in this 1-2 hours, you've seen what politics in Malaysia is. We agree on the issues and we agree broadly the framework, but we will take pot shots at one another. And that's really what is facing us at this point in time. We know that the world doesn't wait. We know that the world is strenuous. We agree that certain fundamental things need to shift. There might be disagreements about the priorities or who should do what first, when and where. But broadly speaking, we need to have clear plans, and we are open to bipartisan and generational cooperation and thinking. But as we think about the long term, as we think about how we make these fundamental and systemic changes, the choice is short term. And I was going to go statesman-like until I heard Kelvin. So I want to remind all of us, and sorry Kelvin, I got to do this. The choice is short term. The choice is, do you pick a party that has a PhD in listing out all the problems, tapi super kindergarten in actually solving them? Or do you pick a party, which is mine, which has the real plan and real credibility to actually fix what needs to be fixed in the medium term and the short term? And I feel, tuan-tuan, puan-puan, saudara-saudari, I feel that all you have to look at when you look at my opponents on the left and right, while we agree on a bunch of stuff, what you have to look at is a track record that they did. And they were the track record, they got into power with all the sea of hope and the sea of expectation. But when they promise youth unemployment, remember what they did. When they promise higher wages, remember what they did. When they promise that they will reduce unequal development, remember what projects they cancelled. When they spoke about government debt and made everyone be scared about 1 trillion ringgit debt, remember what they did, Bond Samurai. That is what you have to remember when you make this short-term choice. None of us on this stage is evil. We all want Malaysia to succeed, but you got to pick right. In the coming months, you will have a choice. Choose stability, choose credibility, choose my party. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of MSLS 3-corner debate. Now, once again, I'd like to thank our distinguished guests on stage. We hope the debate was intriguing, vigorous, and encapsulating. I would now like to invite our speakers to remain on stage for Syed Rifki, the chairperson-elect of UKEC, to present a token of appreciation to our debaters. Our photographer will be capturing this special moment. Right, thank you so much. Now, for the press, an executive member from UKC will be at the door. You can see her raising her hand over there. She'll bring you to the press conference room. Now, I'd like to remind the participants, please, don't stop the speakers. They got to go to the next event. Now, I'll pass it back to our MCs, Chai-Jin and Kian-Jin.
Thank you for the heated debate. It was truly an eye-opening experience to see different perspectives being put forth. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be entering our closing keynote shortly, so please kindly remain seated in the hall as we wait for our closing keynote speaker, the Minister of Higher Education of Malaysia.